Kathleen Clyde represents the 75th Ohio House District, which covers parts of Portage County. She was first elected to the seat in 2010. Clyde is a native of Garrettsville who graduated from James Garfield High School. She got a bachelor's in English from Wesleyan University in Connecticut and her JD from Ohio State in 2008. While in law school, she was an editor of the Law Review, president of the Public Interest Law Foundation, and a student researcher and analyst at OSU's Election Law Center. Clyde was a law clerk for the Ohio Secretary of State and the Ohio Senate, and had a fellowship at the Brendan Center for Justice at New York University for the study of election law. A reminder to everyone, please make sure your cell phones are on vibrate or silence, but please feel free to tweet about what's being said and discussed here. And if you could, please include the @Akron Press Club address. Now, please join me in welcoming Kathleen Clyde to the Akron Press Club.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you to the Akron Press Club. Forums like these are needed now more than ever. They offer the opportunity to have a serious discussion about the issues, rather than politics by tweet or soundbite. They foster mutual understanding among those with divergent viewpoints. They allow for in-depth analysis of complex issues, and they set a model for civility and discourse that others might follow. So thank you, Press Club, for hosting this forum here today. I also want to say thank you to the members of the press for the critical work that you do. At a time when our press is under near constant attack, we must remember the critical role that they play in our democracy. The press educates, it investigates, it questions, it checks against government overreach, and it holds those in power accountable. You know, the lessons that we learned back in civics class really are true. Our democracy depends upon an informed electorate, and an informed electorate depends upon the press. So thank you to the press for upholding your end of the bargain. Our democracy also depends on another critical freedom, and that is the right to vote. And that's what I'd like to explore with you here this afternoon. I remember one of my very first elections. It was in Garrettsville, my hometown, and it was the 1984 mock presidential election in my kindergarten class. And I was very excited to get the chance to vote in that election, just like my parents. I was in the afternoon section of kindergarten with Mrs. Bowen, and when I think back to that critical first election, I know I didn't have to show an ID in order to cast my vote. I didn't have to wait in a long line. I didn't have to worry that my name might not be on the list. I'm pretty sure I wasn't worried about Russian hacking. I got to use my voice, and my vote was counted. And it's a good thing because it was the only one in the entire class for Mondale Ferraro. So, in all seriousness, it was a powerful experience. One girl, one vote. It really shouldn't be more complicated than that. But unfortunately, if you fast forward to where we are right now in 2018, we are seeing a number of restrictions and barriers put in front of the right to vote. And let me walk you through some of those. So the first step in the voting process is making sure that you're registered to vote. And in Ohio, we have had a massive amount of voter purging going on in our state. Now, I'm not opposed to what we do under the law to purge people who have passed away or who moved out of state. That's not the purging I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is in the last 8 years alone, over 2 million Ohio voters have been purged from the voter rolls simply for not voting in a few elections. And that is more than any other state in the entire country. People like Joe Helly, 31 years old, an Army veteran, and the mayor of Oak Harbor, Ohio. He tried to vote after returning home from tours in Iraq and Afghanistan and found that he couldn't. He had been purged for missing a few elections while he was deployed serving our country. We also had Larry Harmon, another Army veteran who lives in Brimfield, Ohio, right in my House district. And he and a group of voting advocates sued Ohio for this harmful voter purging. And that case is currently pending before the United States Supreme Court. We should have a decision sometime in early summer. We also have an outdated voter registration deadline that burdens voters. We all in this room may be pretty used to this, but you have to register to vote 30 days before the election that you want to participate in. Many states have shorter deadlines. This is actually the longest deadline that's allowed under federal law. States may have a 7-day deadline or a 3-day deadline. Many states have same-day voter registration or automatic voter registration. And states that have that have 5 to 10% higher voter turnout than Ohio does. We also have been having trouble in Ohio complying with the motor voter law. This law has been in place now for over 20 years, but we are seeing very low numbers of registrations at our BMV offices when people get their driver's license or their state ID card or interact with that office in some way. In a recent year, Pennsylvania, a state similar to ours, registered 5 times as many voters as Ohio did in the same 1-year period at their BMVs. There's no reason for that discrepancy. We also have a low number of voter registrations at our government agencies that are required to offer voter registration too. And then our online voter registration has really been slow to get off the ground here in Ohio. It first went into effect in January of 2017. In its first year, only 8,300 Ohioans made use of that online voter registration system. Now, part of the problem is it requires a photo identification to use the system. You have to have an Ohio driver's license or an Ohio state ID card. And many Ohioans do not have a driver's license, therefore they're not able to access this online voter registration system. So, once you're registered, the next step is casting your ballot. And in Ohio, there's 2 ways that you can cast your vote. You can vote early, or you can do it the good old-fashioned way and vote on election day. But we have been seeing a number of restrictions being put in front of voters trying to cast their vote. Early voting is the one way to vote, and when you vote early, you can vote by mail, or you can vote at your early vote center. There's one in each county. And we adopted early voting in 2006 because of outrageously long lines to vote in Ohio in 2004. We had 4 to 6 hour long lines wrapping around church parking lots, people waiting in the rain. Actually, the last person to vote in the entire country in 2004 was a Kenyon college student who voted just before 4 a.m. after waiting in line for 9 hours to cast his vote in that election. So we, in a bipartisan way, adopted early voting in our state. Now, over 30% of Ohioans are voting early. And it definitely has helped reduce the lines on election day. One thing that's frustrating when we talk about early voting when we're making policy in Columbus is how the majority party glosses over the reason that we have early voting, and they really beat us over the head with the number of days that we have, as if that alone guarantees that it's easy to vote in Ohio. Well, is it easy to vote if you've been purged? Is it easy to vote if your vote gets thrown out? What if you have to wait in a long line, not on election day, but actually at the early vote center itself? And we're having a number of problems with people waiting in line in our urban areas to cast their early in-person votes. That is because our Ohio law requires that there may only be one early voting center per county. So counties with 15,000 people have the same amount of early voting locations as counties with over 1 million people. And what happens is long lines result in our big cities. For example, in 2016, the line was half a mile long to vote early in Hamilton County. 2 Cincinnati Enquirer reporters stood in that line and clocked their wait time at 2 hours and 50 minutes. We've also seen a constant effort to reduce the opportunities for early voting. The early voting, the first week of early voting was eliminated, and there have been attempts to eliminate the last 3 days of early voting, and we've seen a reduction in the weekend hours and evening hours, which are when working people really can use that early voting opportunity. We've also seen legislation in Columbus that is now law that prohibits local boards of elections from sending absentee ballot applications to all registered voters and from prepaying postage on those envelopes. Now, if you want to send an application to all registered voters, it can only be done by the Secretary of State, only in even year elections, and only if the legislature appropriates the funds to do the mailing. Now, we actually have done that a couple of times since that law was put into place. But our Secretary of State, when he's done the mailing, has left over 1 million voters off the mailing list. These are voters that missed an election, so they are being set up to be purged if they miss 2 more elections. And instead of sending them that application and encouraging them to vote, to get to get off of that purge pipeline that they're in, they are prevented from getting that application. So it actually really isn't going to every registered voter in Ohio. Now, turning to voting on election day. Ohio has aging voting equipment. I have been fighting for funding in our legislature to get resources out to our local communities who need to replace their equipment. Some of it is now 10, 12 years old. It's having problems. There are malfunctions reported in every election. In Franklin County alone, in a recent election, poll workers reported more than 100 voting equipment problems in that election. We're also having some problems with our new voting equipment. Electronic poll books have been instituted in most of our counties across Ohio, but in Hamilton County, in a recent election, 4,000 voters were left off the voter registration list when people showed up to vote on election day. This was because of a programming error in the poll books a few days before the election. So that resulted in long lines and a lot of confusion for our Ohio voters. We've also seen legislative efforts to reduce the number of voting machines that are available on election day and to reduce the amount of poll workers available to help voters. So once you get yourself registered and then you cast your vote either early or on election day, the next step in the process is making sure that your vote gets counted. And unfortunately, Ohio is one of the worst states in the country for counting people's ballots after they've been cast. We actually throw out tens of thousands of people's ballots in every major election in Ohio. People like April Barbasek, 22 years old, from New Philadelphia, Ohio. I was just saying I'll be going to that county later today. She showed up to vote at the correct polling location, but the poll workers directed her to another location, which was actually the wrong location. She went to that location, voted there, and her vote was thrown out because it was not cast in the correct polling place. This same problem happened to 9,000 voters in that one election, and all 9,000 of those votes were thrown out. I think of the story of Roland Gilbert, 86 years old. He lives in Franklin County. He's a retired lawyer, and now he is legally blind. He wrote the current date instead of his birth date on his absentee ballot envelope. All of the other information was correct. We knew who this voter was. We knew he was eligible to vote, yet his vote was thrown out. He was disenfranchised in that election. And the legislature has made this problem worse by passing legislation that requires 5 pieces of information on any provisional ballot envelope and any absentee ballot envelope. And if any information is missing, or if maybe a digit is transposed, say on a zip code, that voter's ballot will be rejected. We also have double bubble ballots in Ohio, which this is a heartbreaking one. I like to call it the belt and suspenders approach. This is where a voter fills in the oval next to their candidate of choice and also writes that same candidate's name in the write-in line for that race on their ballot. We had over 12,000 of those votes in 2008. And under a Democratic Secretary of State, Jennifer Brunner, a directive was issued to count those votes because we knew we knew the intent of the voter. We knew who they were trying to vote for. Under Republican Secretary of State John Husted, he directs that those votes get thrown out. So, despite this picture I painted of decisions by our current Secretary of State and efforts by the legislature to make voting harder, we have had some important wins here in the state of Ohio. While states around us passed laws requiring photo ID to vote, not Ohio. That one comes right out of the GOP voter suppression playbook. It was introduced in my first term in the legislature, but we were able to uncover an embarrassing traffic stop by the legislator who introduced that law. He was caught leaving a strip club drunk with a stripper in his car, and his driver's license had expired. So under his own legislation, he would not have been able to vote in the state of Ohio. We uncovered that. We blasted that legislator. We fought back, and we stopped that bill from becoming law in Ohio. We also stopped something called right church, wrong pew ballots from being thrown out in Ohio. This is where a voter shows up to the correct polling place, but is directed to the wrong precinct table by a poll worker. Secretary of State John Husted was rejecting those ballots. We took him to court, and we won. And now thousands of those votes are being counted. We still need to fight for people like April Barbasek, who was directed to the wrong polling location, but at least a portion of those votes are getting counted because of an important court victory. We also stopped 2 attacks on student voters slipped into budget bills. I see Greta Johnson here. She voted with me on this attack on student voters. And what the Republicans did, and this is pretty creative, they slipped a provision in the state transportation budget that would have thrown college students in jail or charged them up to a $2,500 fine if they registered to vote in Ohio and didn't get an Ohio driver's license and retitle their vehicle in Ohio. Now we came out firing. We blasted that provision. We worked hard with reporters, educating them about what had been tucked away in the legislation. College students were calling the State House. They knew about the provision and they didn't want to have that barrier put in front of them. And by the time we were done fighting, not one Republican would even claim to be the author of that provision, and it was taken out of our state's transportation budget. We also fought all the way to the United States Supreme Court, not once, but twice, to keep the last 3 days of early voting in Ohio. And those 3 days are the 3 busiest days of early voting in the state. And again, our Secretary of State tried to eliminate those days, so did our Republican-controlled legislature, but we've won them back twice. And then finally, I'll talk about a story that is an important one to me that happened in this most recent presidential election. It happened in the presidential primary when a 17-year-old contacted my office because he had been turned away from voting in the presidential primary. And I thought, that's funny. Under Ohio law, as long as you're 18 by the general election, you can vote in the primary even if you're only 17. So sure enough, I called some of my local election officials, and they told me that our Secretary of State had issued a directive banning those young people from participating in the presidential primary. So I right away issued a public statement calling on our Secretary of State to reverse this illegal order. He refused, and he and I started battling. And meanwhile, the 17-year-olds came out of the woodwork. They were tweeting, they were texting, they were calling their legislators, they were Snapchatting. They even held a protest in downtown Columbus outside of the Secretary of State's office building, but still he refused to budge. So a lawyer friend of mine and I gathered a group of 9 of those 17-year-olds. We filed a lawsuit in state court, and just a couple of days before that presidential primary election day, we won. And over 12,000 17-year-olds across Ohio were able to participate in the presidential primary. That's what our democracy is supposed to look like. So if we did all of this, despite being in the super minority in the state legislature, think what we can do if we take back this office. We must also work hard to address the gerrymandering that is taking place in our state. Our hyper-partisan system for drawing legislative districts in Ohio truly makes a mockery of our elections. We have one party walking away with 3/4 of our congressional districts when they're only getting roughly half the votes. And the problem is bad in our state legislature too. We have veto-proof majorities in both the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate, despite our voters being about 50-50 Republican and Democrat. This robs people of the power of their vote. It creates extreme polarization where leaders are running to the extreme of their party rather than working for everyone and reaching out across the aisle. And it's these rigged partisan districts that got us 38 bills introduced since I've been in the legislature to restrict voting in some way, 13 of which have been signed into law. These districts are what got us union-busting Senate Bill 5. They're what got us 20 new restrictions on women's reproductive health care in the last 8 years alone. And they are why we are giving billions of public tax dollars to for-profit failing charter schools in our state. Now, I come from an almost extinct type of district. It's competitive. Governor Kasich won my House district, President Obama won my House district, and President Trump won my House district. A district like that means you have to campaign hard there. You have to be visible to the voters in the state. You have to make sure that you're responsive to your constituents. And you have to reach across the aisle. You have to talk to Republicans, and you have to talk to independent voters and work hard to bring people together to be successful. More districts need to be like that in Ohio. And I will use my place on the state's redistricting commission to undo these unfair, unjust districts in our state. Ohioans so deserve to have fair districts. We have made some important progress in this area as well, despite the one-party rule in Columbus. In 2015, you all had the opportunity to vote on a state ballot issue to improve how we draw our legislative districts in the state. That was something that I worked on as a member of the legislature to give you the opportunity to vote on it. And when we come to the redrawing process in 2021, we will have minority input in the process for the first time, and we will have rules that prevent partisan gerrymandering. And now, another one of those issues is coming before us. The Democrats and Republicans in the legislature, we came together with the Fair Districts Coalition, who had gathered tens of thousands of signatures because this issue is so critically important, and we reached a compromise. And that compromise is on the ballot on May 8th. It will be State Issue 1. It too allows input from the minority party, and it puts rules in place that prevent the hyper-partisan gerrymandering that we currently are suffering under. And I strongly encourage you to be supportive of that, to vote yes on State Issue 1 in May. So I'll also just talk briefly about what I plan to do when I'm Secretary of State in Ohio. I want to work to make sure that we have fair and secure elections in our state. I want to fight for automatic voter registration. 50% of Americans now live in states that have automatic voter registration. Ohio should be next. Automatic registration improves turnout, it improves access, it improves accuracy of our voter rolls, and it saves us money. I also will stop purging infrequent voters, and I'll work to make sure we are counting people's votes. And together, I think we can work to reverse the harmful legislation that's been put in place that cut early voting, that throws out more ballots, and that makes purging easier in our state. I also want to focus on cybersecurity. Our election system was attacked in 2016, and intelligence officials are telling us that we are going to be targeted in 2018 as well. What I want to do in the Secretary of State's office is establish a cybersecurity director to make sure we are ready for the challenges that we're facing, and a bipartisan council of security experts, voter advocates, and election officials to help make sure our counties are prepared for the future. I also want to push counties to move to voter-marked, voter-verified paper ballots, and I want to require mandatory audits after elections to make sure there's no problems with the voting equipment and that the vote total is correct. We need to give our voters confidence that our election system is secure and working accurately. I also want to decrease the influence of money in our political system. One way that we can do that under this Citizens United world that we live in is to make sure that we have transparency and disclosure. And if you go onto the Secretary of State's website right now, it's not really easy to get that disclosure. I want to improve that so we know who is contributing money, how much, and to what candidates. I also want to shed light on secret money by requiring shadow LLCs funding ballot initiatives in Ohio and super PACs to show who their donors are and require that that information be made public. We also need to stop foreign money from influencing our Ohio elections. The Secretary of State's office is also the first stop for any new business that's registering in the state. And I want to make sure we're as helpful and inclusive as possible to anyone who wants to do business here. I want to cut red tape for voters and for our Ohio businesses as well. I think most of us know our Ohio job growth has trailed the national average for 5 years now. And our household income is thousands of dollars less than the national average as well. We need to be doing everything we can to help our Ohio businesses. I want to make sure my office is helpful and streamlined, not unresponsive and bureaucratic. I want to modernize the office's tools and prioritize our small businesses. This will allow Ohio businesses that are large and growing or small and home-based to thrive in order to make our community stronger. You know, I really do believe that together we can end the gerrymandering in our state and we can make our state more business friendly. I want to partner with all of you to do that. And just like I learned back in Garrettsville in my kindergarten class, we can have easy and fair elections in our state. That's what I'll bring to this office. That's what I'll bring to Ohio as your next Secretary of State. Thank you so much, everyone.
Secrecy. It's now time for questions. If you haven't already filled out one of these cards, they're at the center of your tables. Grab them, scribble your question on them legibly so I can make them out, and we'll fire away at Ms. Clyde. First question, I always get to ask the first one. It's a privilege of being the moderator here. I really want to hear more about your plans for cybersecurity. We've heard a lot about how the U.S. elections were at risk in 2016. There's been discussion about whether or not Ohio's voting machines were really subject to being hacked in the 2016 elections, or subsequently. You're talking about creating a special position to help ensure security. Give us more details on that and what you can do, if elected, to ensure there really is security when we go to the polls.
Well, thank you. And this has been a huge priority for me as a candidate for Secretary of State. Ohio was one of 21 states that was targeted by foreign hackers in the 2016 election. And while that was not a hack into our voting equipment, it was targeting our state voter registration list. That doesn't mean that we don't have to worry about our voting equipment in upcoming elections. We need to help counties have the resources they need to replace that aging voting equipment. And we really do need to, especially when we are providing the funding as a state, we need to make sure that counties are required to purchase paper ballot systems when they use those funds. And what those do is ensure that there is a paper record of what happens in an election. On electronic machines, the record is an electronic record. We need to have paper ballot so that we're able to go back and have something to count if there's a problem on election day, and that we can audit to make sure our voting equipment is working correctly in our elections. Cybersecurity should be a priority in the office. That's why I want to hire an expert in the office. And this is an issue that is constantly evolving. So that person can benefit from the advice of our election officials who are on the front lines, Democrat and Republican, and also from security experts who are always looking for what the next threat may be. And it will be a process into the future to keep our system safe. I want to make it clear that that's a priority in my Secretary of State administration to do that.
You're supporting issue 1. In your opinion, does it go far enough to end partisan gerrymandering?
I do support state issue 1. I think it is a compromise that Republicans and Democrats and the coalition of groups labeled the Fair Districts Coalition came together to put on the ballot. It's not the perfect plan. It won't eliminate partisan gerrymandering, but what it does, it takes a critical first step towards making sure that our congressional districts are fair. I'd like to see us go further at some point. I'd like to use the platform of the Secretary of State's office to push for even better reform. But for this ballot issue, it will take our state forward. And that's why I'm working so hard, stumping around the state, encouraging voters to vote yes on issue 1.
Here's an interesting one. A hypothetical. If the Democrats take control of the state legislature and statewide offices, will you still support nonpartisan methods of redistricting and reject gerrymandering? You talk the talk, will you walk the walk?
I absolutely will walk the walk when it comes to drawing fair districts in our state. Our state has suffered for too long under this system. We've had 30 years of Republican majorities, gerrymandering districts, and taking our state in the wrong direction. I know that Democrats can win on fair districts. I've always been committed to fair districts. I'm not going to try to game the system for my party like has been done for so long. I'm committed to fair districts. You can see it in my record. I've introduced proposals to draw fair districts in Ohio that have that criteria that prevent partisan gerrymandering. And I'm going to take those ideas into the redistricting commission and make sure that we prioritize not Democratic districts, not Republican districts, but fair districts that Ohioans so deserve.
Why do you think it's important that Ohio elects a Democrat as Secretary of State, especially looking ahead to 2020?
I think it's important that Ohio elects a Secretary of State that is focused on fair and secure elections in our state. Ohio is the most important battleground state in the country. We shouldn't be having these problems with purging millions of voters, with throwing out tens of thousands of votes, with having aging voting equipment that voters must cast their vote on with uncertainty as to whether these systems are safe. I will prioritize fairness, not purging voters, but working to get them registered, counting people's votes, and making sure that our system is secure so you can have confidence that your vote is counted and that your voice is being heard.
What can the Secretary of State do to help turn out the vote? What should the Secretary of State do for that? And also, how would you address voter apathy?
Well, one of the things that I am a huge advocate for, and I talked about it during my remarks, is automatic voter registration. We must work to bring that to Ohio. We were one of the last states to adopt online voter registration, and we're struggling to see that get off the ground. But let's not be the last state to adopt automatic voter registration. The states that have that have higher turnout than Battleground Ohio does, and not just a little bit. I mean, those states have close to 10% higher voter turnout. So that is one policy area I would definitely focus on in order to get more people participating in our democracy. I think too that we need to be engaging with young voters. The story about the 17-year-old voters, we shouldn't be finding ways to turn people away and to throw out people's votes, especially our young people and our first-time voters. We should be educating them about their rights and encouraging them to turn out to vote, not working to throw their ballots out and to discourage them from participating in the process. And the same goes for how we treat our student voters. This party in power in Columbus has worked very hard to make it more difficult for college students to vote. That's the exact opposite of what we should be doing. We need to work hard to engage young people, get people out to vote, and make registering to vote much easier.
In your remarks, you went through a number of things you plan to do if elected. What would be the first issue or problem that you would deal with? What's priority number one?
Well, that's a hard one because all the issues I talked about are deeply important to me. But I really want to work hard to make sure we hit the ground running on day one, both to help our businesses and our economy, and also make sure we are prepared for the upcoming presidential election in 2020.
Related to business, it's very much part of the responsibilities of Secretary of State. We have a question about what legislation have you introduced while you're in the legislature to help Ohio businesses?
Well, I've done a number of work in the legislature to help small businesses, especially those that are in my House district. I've had initiatives that have been worked into bills that have become law that help small businesses in my district. There are specific examples, but they were facing regulatory burdens in trying to expand their business, and we were able to kind of cut through that red tape and help those businesses succeed. I have co-sponsored a number of pieces of legislation to create a more business-friendly environment, and I now am engaging in a process of working with our small businesses to talk about what they would like to see from the Secretary of State's office and how we can improve upon the processes and streamline the services of the Secretary of State to help businesses at a time when they're most vulnerable and in their early